the September 11th attacks were on a Tuesday. Robert Mueller had only been the FBI director for less than a week at that point. He was summoned to the presidential retreat in Camp David, Maryland, where President George W. Bush was ensconced with his top advisors. Mueller comes and gives his report on the FBI investigation, identifying all 19 hijackers, tracing them back to their connections to Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. When he was done presenting that complete report, President George W. Bush just looked at him and said, "I don't care about that. I just want to know how you're going to prevent the next one." Mueller walked out of that meeting humiliated, and he said, bound and determined to change the culture of the FBI. That cultural change had a lot of bad effects, a lot of unintended consequences.
Today on Bets and Badges, we have the pleasure and honor of introducing and speaking with Thomas J. Baker, a 33-year FBI agent, retired now, a international consultant who is the legal attaché for not just the FBI, but the United States and two embassies, the embassy in France, the U.S. embassy that is in France, and the U.S. embassy in Australia. I am Robert Asencio, and today on Bets and Badges, I have my colleague and co-host, retired police chief David Magnusson, who is also a military historian. How are you, sir?
Hey, I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Oh, man, I'm looking forward to getting into this interview.
Listen, FBI, I want to hear more.
Yes, sir. Especially now that we know that there's some changes on the horizon, administrative changes, at least at the words of the President-elect, Donald J. Trump. Thomas, welcome, sir. How are you?
Fine this morning. Glad to be with you, Robert and Dave.
Outstanding. Now, what I did not mention is that you are the author of a book that is titled The Fall of the FBI, How Once Great Agency has Become a Threat to Democracy.
As you know, the sub-theme of the book is the good, the bad, and the ugly, because I just didn't want it to be a critique or a criticism. I wanted to lay out what the FBI had been, what it had achieved, the good, also the bad, instances in the past that we've all seen in our law enforcement careers, and it kind of shocks us at first, of injustice. And I know you had Jim McDonald on your show talking about an instance of injustice in a criminal proceeding. And then the ugly, and the ugly is what has happened, what the Comey cabal has done to the FBI, and what it has brought about, the problems that have come to the surface recently.
Now, I want to preface the rest of this conversation by saying, to the dedicated men and women who serve our country, who work for the FBI, who are doing an honorable job, this is no slight on you. Our country is dependent on the top law enforcement agency. But we do know that there's some inherent problems. And I want to talk to you about this, the insider. Tom, you spent 33 years in the agency, in the Bureau. You went from New York, you met an officer, which I love for you to talk about, Eddie Murphy, right? Later on, you meet him, and later on you wind up investigating him or signing a case to investigate him for public corruption, right? Yet he's the one that directs you to the FBI. So you start out, the photo department, and you work your way up to being the legal attaché in two U.S. embassies. Man, if there's ever an honorable job, that's it, an honorable post. But Tom, what are your observations? Where did the FBI begin to shift? And to frame it out, I asked a question, but I want to frame it up real quick. Your state that the FBI now has become more of an intelligence gathering agency than a law enforcement agency. But where do you think that balance has been broken, and where do you see the errors come from?
Okay, that's the key question. And in my assessment, I go back, and in the prologue of the book, I talk about this incident. And by the way, this incident has been documented by people who were there. And the key character, from my point of view, Robert Mueller, who was then the director of the FBI, has personally told me this, and then I heard him recount this actually to a gathering of police chiefs on more than one occasion. The September 11th attacks were on a Tuesday morning, and on the follow, and Robert Mueller had only been the FBI director for less than a week at that point. He was summoned to the White House, not the White House, but the presidential retreat in Camp David, Maryland, where President George W. Bush was ensconced with his top advisors. We have a photograph of that meeting. Condoleezza Rice is sitting at his right hand. They're all ruggedly dressed in this, in this essentially log cabin, and Mueller comes and gives his report on the FBI investigation. And in 3.5 days, the FBI had done what it does best: investigate. And he presented this report, and the FBI had identified, and of course, relying on not only our state and local partners, but our international partners. And they came up with a report identifying all 19 hijackers, all their bona fides, their credit cards, their rental cards, their past travel patterns, their association, tracing them back to their connections to Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. When he was done presenting that complete report, expecting praise or thanks, and he admitted this later, President George W. Bush just looked at him and said, "I don't care about that. I just want to know how you're going to prevent the next one." And then within the hour, George Tenet, then the director of the CIA, presented a report, a plan of action, really going forward to take the fight to the terrorists. And when he was done, George W. Bush said, "That's great." Then he turned and looked at Mueller and he said, "That's what I want to hear." Mueller walked out of that meeting humiliated, and he said, bound and determined to change the culture, and that's the word he used, of the FBI from a law enforcement mindset to an intelligence mindset. And he made the FBI into an intelligence agency. Now, people can argue historically there may have been good reasons for it at that moment in time. But the reality is that cultural change had a lot of bad effects, a lot of unintended consequences.
Any thoughts?
What were the unintended consequences?
That's why I was going to go.
Oh, I see. We know each other well.
Yeah. Sir?
Okay. Well, what happens, and you gentlemen realize this, and if you reflect on it, I'm sure you'll realize it. In a law enforcement agency, you exist every day for when that day comes that you have to raise your right hand before a judge, a magistrate, a jury, a grand jury, and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to a set of facts. That's so fundamentally different from an intelligence agency that doesn't deal in facts, that doesn't deal in evidence. They deal in estimates and best guesses. And of course, guesses aren't allowed in the courtroom. And in their mindset, their tool is deception. And this deception that they deal with gets into their daily life and affects a lot of the things they do. So that's the intelligence culture. The law enforcement culture is trying, and we all know sometimes it's imperfect, but it's trying to adhere to the Constitution. Not only adhere to the rules of the Constitution, and as you know, in law enforcement, talking about the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment, but in the case of the FBI, we were trained to protect the Constitution, to protect all of those first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, protect people's freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to vote, freedom of the press, etc. It's changed the whole mindset. And a lot of the mistakes and the loose thinking that's gone on and that's come to light in the past 4 to 8 years is a result of this change in mindset, this change in culture.
So, to be clear, right, and to make sure that I'm not putting words in your mouth, what you're saying is that because of this change of practice, if you will, culture, that leans more into intelligence gathering, there is some basically lies going on?
You can use lies in certain contexts, yes, because the intelligence officers, and believe me, I have respectful for what they do for their mission. But overseas in the American embassies where you have legats, such as I was, and you have our intelligence agencies represented, we often have to interface with them, and we just come at things from just a different point of view. And I explain that, as you know, in the book in some detail. But they don't hesitate to lie. And some of them who I actually become friends with, they will admit that this is literally an occupational danger. Uh, if I can digress for a second, we talk about, and earlier in the book, I talked about some of the dangers to law enforcement, state, local, and federal, that there's a danger of becoming jaded, of becoming cynical, of thinking everybody's a crook or everybody's bad. And we have to guard against that. Well, in the intelligence agencies, their danger is they get in a habit of lying. And that's the word lying. They use the word operating. They operate all day long. And it gets to the point that they operate with their co-workers, their other Americans in the embassy, but also some of them have admitted, and this is a problem they have. Now, how does that spill over into the FBI? After September 11th, there was a new position created, intelligence analyst. The intelligence analyst job in the FBI was modeled on the CIA analyst, which many agents at the time even thought that was a mistake because it really didn't fit in a domestic security agency, the type of intelligence analyst they had in the CIA. Because in the CIA, and think about this, they encouraged the intelligence analysts to be imaginative, to be free thinkers, to imagine whatever they want and think about whatever they want. That really doesn't fit in a domestic intelligence agency trying to operate in a democracy where you have to respect people's rights. So we have the phenomenon that happened last year. It came to light, and it's well documented now, where you have a couple of intelligence analysts and their supervisor rethinking and coming up with the idea that Catholics who prefer traditional worship, use of Latin, etc., that they somehow are potential domestic extremists, domestic terrorists, and they tried to initiate investigations of those individuals and groups. That's way out of line. That's having no regard for the Attorney General guidelines, which the agents used to be trained to, that there were certain things you had to be very careful of stepping around. And certainly the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech are two of those things.
Let me bring it back to something that's a little bit more contextually relevant to those that will listen here. Is the misinformation that you're speaking of when they're building cases politically driven?
And that certainly came to light in the initiation of the Russian collusion investigation. Looking back on that, the Inspector General reports, of which there's been several, and the Durham report, Durham being a special counsel that was appointed by Attorney General Bill Barr to look in this, they looked into it thoroughly, and it turns out there really was no justification for initiating that investigation. And that should have been handled with the greatest sensitivity because it any investigation that impacts the civil liberties of an American citizen should be handled carefully. But it's even more sensitive when you're investigating a presidential candidate and a presidential campaign. And that investigation was initiated in retrospect with no justification. And that was the finding of the Durham report.
You know, just to use an old euphemism, I mean, FBI's basically should be Joe Friday, just the facts. Whatever's there, you go down that road. You investigate it because there's nobody better in investigating things like that than the FBI. Okay. I understand what the CIA or intelligence needs to do. And I think most Americans feel the same. Listen, get the job done. We understand how the CIA or intelligence has to go about their thing. And I think by the same token, they expect the FBI to go down a certain road too, to be that model of professionalism. Now, this is all very intriguing, the information we're hearing now, and you know the motivations, the ulterior motives, as you would. So I want to hear more about it.
So you know, as a person who's run investigative units, right, myself, I look at the chain of command, right? The levels, the check levels, if you will. There's a level of supervisory command. There's a review process where the facts are vetted, not vetted, but examined, right, and ensured that contextually that investigation is based on facts, right, before it even goes anywhere, before it even evolves and more resources are put into it. But what you're saying and what you point in your book paints a picture that at all levels of these checks and balance sections, there's a buy-in to this embellishment practice. Is that what you're saying? That at all levels of the check process, or are they just skipped? Please give us some insight.
Robert, you're onto something there. And as you say, I do mention this in the book. One of the things Mueller did when he deliberately decided to change the culture of the FBI, he wanted more centralization. So traditionally, and when I say traditionally, I mean for 75 years, the FBI had a system of case management that involved what they called an office of origin. So wherever the case started, let's say in Miami or Jacksonville, that office was the office of origin in the case. But agents, a case agent, had the authority to set out leads. If leads needed to be covered in Mississippi or Georgia or someplace further afield, they send a lead and request that office to go out and conduct an interview or do a record search or whatever the case may be. And that case was managed in a field office. So you had the case agent managing it. His field supervisor and another agent, more experienced, would be looking over his shoulder. Then you had the agent in charge of that office, perhaps looking over their shoulder. And only then would the results of that investigation go to Washington to headquarters, where somebody else, removed, more objective, would look at it again. And this was a good safeguard. Layers of review, layers of independent judgment. As you both probably know and perhaps have experienced in your own careers, investigators, police officers, and they get their own case, they get very enthusiastic about it. Good ones do. And you might focus on a particular subject, and you need someone looking over your shoulder coming in and saying, well, wait, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? We all need a little bit of guidance and independent judgment. Well, Mueller did away with all those layers of judgment. He took the first case ever in the history of the FBI to be managed from headquarters, was what was called Pent Bomb, which was the FBI's code name for the investigation of the September 11th attacks. He had that run out of headquarters, not out of New York or Washington Field, which would have been two logical places for it, or even in Pittsburgh, where there was one attack. But he had it run out of headquarters. So he eliminated layers of review, layers of independent judgment. That model was again used by Comey. For the first time he used it was in the Hillary Clinton email investigation, a sensitive political investigation, and then in, as we all know now, the Russian collusion investigation. So you had in that instance a situation where on a Sunday, this fellow Peter Strzok, a deputy assistant director, rather high-ranking individual, came into FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and wrote a communication opening the investigation of the Trump campaign, setting out a lead for an individual in London to be interviewed. And the following day, he left Washington, went to London, and conducted that interview himself. He wrote the opening communication, he approved it, he sent it out, and he, a deputy assistant director, flew to London and conducted the first interview in that investigation. No levels of review, no levels of independent judgment. It was bound to end badly.
So you're talking about the Steele dossier. For those of you that are interested in finding out more about what Thomas J. Baker's talking about, please consider buying his book, The Fall of the FBI. It's up on the screen. Can you provide him a link of where to find it, Thomas?
Certainly, it's available on Amazon.com. That's where a lot of people buy their books today, and also Barnes & Noble online and in many Barnes & Noble stores. Yes.
Tom has been involved in a lot of cases that we have witnessed.
Yeah.
and seen in the media.
Yep.
He can give us a lot of insight. But I know that you have worked with the FBI.
Well, to be fair, and to the credit to the FBI, I'm extremely proud. I was the NA member, Session 224.
Tell us about your opinion on where does the FBI go now, right?
What happened in Crossfire Hurricane was not just a few bad apples like Strzok and Comey. It was the culture allowed it to happen. And you have to change the culture. It'll take an effort, but that's what needs to be done.
Well, thank you. David, any closing thoughts real quick?
When you change a culture, perhaps it's easy because you know where the culture, what you left from. Go back to it. So you're not having to reinvent it. Go back to where you started from. What's your base? What's your core value right there? Because as Tom said, you left from that to go into intelligence. Maybe easier said than done, but return to it.
Yeah. So just in closing, first of all, thank you for your service once again. Can't thank you enough. For those of you that have been watching, are more interested, please stay tuned because we will have more with Thomas J. Baker, more insight of the FBI. My name is Robert Asencio. I'm here with David Magnusson. This has been another episode of Bets and Badges. Ray Shell and our producer behind the scenes. Thank you, Michael Grant Miller, the community news team. We can't thank you enough, and you, the audience. We look forward to speaking with you in the coming days, coming weeks. You can find us on all podcast platforms under Bets and Badges or at Bets and Badges.